The first thing I noticed was the hush, that soft drop in a crowded Sarasota bistro when recognition passes from one table to another like a current. The hostess had just taken our menus when I saw them, Gavin and Nora, sitting too close, their smiles too tight, frozen mid-sip, as if the stemware itself had protested. Marcus slid my chair out with an easy, practiced grace, the kind that told a room he was comfortable anywhere, and I felt the old tremor in my hands steady. Gavin's jaw shifted that tick he never could hide, while Nora's napkin crumpled in her fist. I didn't speak. I let the silence bloom and do the work I used to do with pleasantries. When Marcus introduced himself as my partner, the word rang like cut crystal and kept ringing. I lifted my water, caught Gavin's reflection in the window, and watched the color creep from his face, as if the glass had told the truth before either of us could. Before I go on, tell me where you're listening from tonight. I love knowing the towns and front porches that keep me company. And if you're here for stories where dignity doesn't just survive, but returns stronger, tap like and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. My name is Marion, 42 now, and I have the kind of job where you learn what people hide in plain sight. Children will trust you with the truth adults won't say out loud. I grew up in a teacher's house with second-hand furniture and first-rate expectations. Look people in the eye, return what you borrow, and never mistake noise for substance. When I met Gavin at a charity 5K downtown, he was all motion and charm, bright shoes and brighter plans, and I thought his momentum would carry us. He talked about building a boutique brokerage that would lift families like mine and impressed my father with how he remembered names after a handshake. We married in a Methodist chapel with white hydrangeas and a rental quartet. I still remember my mother whispering that a steady life is made, not gifted. The steady part fell to me while he chased bigger tables. When he studied late for his broker's exams, I color-coded flashcards and tucked them beside a coffee mug, then headed out for a second shift at the community center to cover our bills. When he pitched investors, I ironed shirts before sunrise and packed lunches with sticky notes for Sophie, tiny paper anchors, when meetings ran over and bedtime slipped. The year the market turned in his favor, he stopped bringing home takeout and started coming home later, calling it optics, saying clients preferred to see him free, not tied down. I told myself it made sense that momentum was messy, that my quiet lane kept the road safe for both of us. We were a Sarasota postcard from the street, trimmed palms, a swing on the porch, a child's bike helmet looped over the mailbox after school. Sundays belonged to pancakes and church, and the kind of small talk that makes a marriage seem simple even when you're counting the hours you don't say what you mean. He traded polos for tailored jackets and learned the names of wines that come with stories, while I learned which parents needed an extra call after a tough week. We had friends who came for chili on game nights. Nora was there most often, an old college friend of mine with quick laughter and a knack for showing up just when I needed another pair of hands. If there were cracks, then they were hairline, the kind that hide under paint, and good lighting. There were days when I loved the routine so much, I didn't look up to see how much of it I carried. I'd rinse Sophie's jersey in the sink at 10 p.m., answer emails for a fundraiser, and tell myself that a busy marriage is a blessed one. Gavin talked about an expansion across the bridge, a second office with glass walls and his name etched on metal, and I nodded, even when he stopped asking if Saturday mornings belonged to us. I had learned to be useful and underestimated the cost of being invisible. In a counselor's chair, I asked children what safe feels like. At our dinner table, I said we were fine, and flinched when my fork tapped the plate too hard. The first real tension did not arrive as a shout or a slammed door. It came in a scent, citrus and musk, too sharp for the hour he claimed to be at the gym. It came in the new habit of leaving his ring by the sink for swelling and forgetting to put it back on before meetings. It came in Nora's laugh at a backyard barbecue, not the easy kind that folds you in, but the bright, brittle kind that lands and lingers, followed by her hand on his sleeve a beat too long. I caught my reflection in the sliding door glass, holding a tray of watermelon, a hostess in her own home, blinking at the echo of a story I tell other women to listen to. I set the tray down and told myself to stop being dramatic, that familiarity breeds shortcuts, not betrayals. But the truth doesn't disappear because you soften its edges. It waits at the edge of a room and looks back when you do. After the guests left that night, I wiped rings from the porch table and thought about the way Nora's eyes tracked him when he moved across the yard. The fan clicked above me steady, like a metronome for a life I had kept on beat. I stood under it and felt a new quiet settle, the kind before a storm, when even the birds hold their breath. And that's where part 2 begins, on the night I planned a celebration for the man I loved and heard a single word that made the room go silent. The celebration I planned for Gavin's birthday was meant to honor how far we had come. I booked a private room at a restaurant overlooking the bay, chose the cake myself, and sent invitations to the people who had stood beside us from the beginning. Sophie helped me fold place cards with her careful handwriting, each one balanced between optimism and pride. I imagined that evening as a turning point, a reminder that sacrifices had not been wasted, that family and work and friendship could still exist under one roof. When the night arrived, the tables glowed with votive candles, the sound of silverware and laughter spilling softly across the room. Gavin entered wearing a new jacket I had never seen, his smile broad, his handshake deliberate with every guest. I watched him lean into conversations, his voice carrying easily the kind of presence I once believed was leadership. Nora arrived just behind him, sliding into the circle as if she had always belonged. Her laughter rose above the others, a little sharper than usual. Yet it drew no suspicion except mine. I set out the cake, later the candles flickering against the walls, my chest filling with a complicated kind of pride. I thought I had done something good for him, for us. But then I saw it. A small gesture at first, her hand brushing his sleeve when no one was supposed to notice, his head tilted close as if secrets were being exchanged between the notes of a song. I tried to look away, convincing myself it was nothing more than comfort between friends. Then came the word that pulled the room into silence. He bent toward her, the smile still fixed on his face, and whispered, "Baby." My stomach turned cold before my mind could catch up, and I saw the shift ripple through the tables. Guests lowered their eyes, forks stilled midair, and I heard the kind of whisper that carries more truth than any announcement. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a joke. It was confirmation of every quiet doubt I had ever dismissed. I stood there, the cake knife still in my hand, while Nora's face flushed with a mixture of pride and fear. Gavin didn't bother to look ashamed. His smirk told me he believed the damage was already done, that I had nowhere to go. My chest burned as though the air had been stripped from the room. I crossed the distance between us and met his eyes. For a moment, he looked almost proud, as if daring me to make a scene. My palm connected with his cheek before I even realized I had moved. The sound cracked across the table, cutting through the murmurs, leaving only stunned silence behind. Without another word, I walked out, my heels sharp against the floor, leaving the candles to flicker over the mess they had created. At home, I sat in the kitchen, still wearing the dress I had chosen so carefully for the occasion. The makeup smeared on my face felt like paint on cracked glass. The clock ticked past midnight and then into dawn, and I remained at that table, unable to sleep, unable to cry. When Sophie came down the stairs, her hair tangled from sleep, she stopped in the doorway. She saw everything: the dress, the swollen eyes, the untouched coffee cup beside me. She sat across from me, her small hands folded on the table, and whispered, "Mom, I saw them. I know what they did. Please don't let him get away with it." Her words landed heavier than any insult Gavin had ever thrown at me. They came from a child who had already carried more than she should, a child who deserved to see her mother stand, not break. For years, I had told myself that marriage was sacrifice, that good wives shoulder burdens while their husbands climb. I convinced myself that love could excuse silence, that friendship could erase suspicion. But that morning, as my daughter looked at me with eyes wiser than her age, I knew the lies had reached their end. This wasn't just about betrayal between adults. This was about the example I would set for her, the truth she would carry into her own life. I could not let her believe that women bend until they shatter. I could not let her see me surrender. The house was quiet as I moved through it later that day, folding away pieces of the life I thought I had built. Gavin's shoes stood polished by the door, his cufflinks scattered across the dresser, Nora's laughter still echoing faintly in my ears. I gathered the strength I had buried beneath years of compromise and felt something shift inside me. The pain was still sharp, but beneath it, a steady flame began to burn. He thought he had humiliated me beyond repair. What he had done was wake a part of me that would not bend again. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the palms and painted the walls with fading light, I stood at the back door and watched Sophie playing in the yard. She swung higher than she should have legs, kicking hair flying, laughing, as if the world had not tilted the night before. I promised myself then that she would never see me silent again. Whatever steps came next, they would be mine, not Gavin's, not Nora's. And when the reckoning arrived, it would not be in shadows or whispers, but in the clear light of truth. After the birthday party shattered in front of me, the days that followed felt heavy, as if every corner of the house carried a shadow I couldn't shake. I moved quietly, folding laundry, preparing meals, answering Sophie's questions with care. But inside, there was a silence that throbbed louder than any words. My body went through the motions, but my mind circled endlessly, replaying the way Gavin had smirked, the way Nora's hand had rested on his arm without shame. Nights were the worst. The darkness pressed in, and I stared at the ceiling long after Sophie had fallen asleep, feeling the ache in my chest settle into something colder, something sharper. At school, I listened to children tell me about their small heartbreaks, friendships, broken parents who argued too loud, the kind of stories I was supposed to hold gently. I smiled, nodded, and offered comfort, yet my own story roared beneath the surface. In the quiet of my office, I sometimes caught my reflection in the glass, and it startled me. My eyes looked older than I remembered, lined with exhaustion, as though grief had left fingerprints I couldn't wipe away. Colleagues stopped me in the hall, asked if I was all right, and I said yes with a voice that didn't sound like mine. I told myself that if I kept the routine, maybe I could hold everything together. Evenings at home became a balancing act between hiding my pain and staying honest with Sophie. She was too smart to be fooled, and I could see the worry in her eyes when she studied my face. One night, as we sat on the couch with a blanket draped across our laps, she leaned her head against my shoulder. "You don't have to pretend with me, Mom," she whispered. My throat tightened, and I smoothed her hair, forcing a steady breath. I know I told her, though the truth was, I didn't know how to stop pretending. She was 12, but her presence was steady, and in those moments, I felt like she was the one holding me upright. I tried to hide from the world outside our door, but it had a way of finding me. Friends who had been at Gavin's party began calling, their voices edged with sympathy and curiosity. I answered some, ignored others, unable to stomach their pity. The whispers in our community moved faster than I could avoid them. At the grocery store, I caught the glance of a neighbor who quickly looked away, her cart turning down another aisle. At church, a few well-meaning women pressed my hand and offered prayers with eyes full of questions they didn't ask aloud. Every look reminded me that I wasn't invisible, that my humiliation wasn't a private wound anymore. It was a scar the whole town had seen form in real time. The house itself became unbearable. Gavin's cologne lingered on the dresser, his shoes lined neatly by the door. All reminders of a life that felt false now. I found myself moving through rooms like a guest in my own home, careful not to disturb the stillness that no longer felt safe. In the kitchen, where Sophie once did homework as I cooked, the silence seemed hollow. At night, when the air conditioner hummed, I sometimes imagined I heard voices, laughter that wasn't mine, whispered words that didn't belong. The walls once filled with warmth seemed to press in with memories I wanted to erase. Still, I stayed frozen between the comfort of familiarity and the weight of betrayal. There were moments when grief blurred into anger so suddenly I startled myself. Folding a shirt Gavin had left behind, I caught the scent and felt my hand tremble with rage. I threw it into a bag, shoved it deep in the closet, and shut the door with force. Washing dishes one evening, I pressed a plate into the rack too hard and heard the sharp crack as it split in two. I stood staring at it, water dripping from my hands, realizing that I had been holding myself so tightly together that even porcelain knew how to break before I did. These flashes of fury frightened me, yet they also told me something, that my sadness wasn't all that remained. Beneath it, strength was stirring. One Saturday afternoon, Sophie and I sat on the back steps, eating popsicles as the sun dipped low. She watched me carefully, her feet swinging above the grass. "You're different," she said, almost to herself. I turned to her, unsure how to answer. "Different how?" She shrugged, thoughtful. "You're quieter, but also stronger. Like you're not going to let him win." Her words sank deep, and I realized she saw something in me I hadn't allowed myself to believe. I reached for her hand and held it, feeling both comfort and responsibility. I could not collapse, not when her eyes were on me, waiting for proof that betrayal didn't mean defeat. The hardest moments were the quiet ones. Mornings when I poured coffee and the seat across from me stayed empty, evenings when the phone lit up with Gavin's name and I let it ring unanswered. Each silence was a reminder of what had been lost and what I refused to take back. I prayed sometimes, asking for strength, not for reconciliation. In those prayers, I began to hear my own voice returning, steady, determined. It was not loud, not triumphant, but it was mine, and I clung to it like a lifeline. There was no grand gesture that marked the shift inside me, only the slow accumulation of small choices. I stopped wearing my wedding ring, leaving it on the dresser where it caught the morning light, but no longer belonged to me. I began keeping a journal, writing down every thought I couldn't share with anyone else. The pages filled quickly, scribbled with questions and confessions, but also with plans I wasn't ready to admit out loud. Each word I wrote chipped away at the silence, carving space for the woman I had almost forgotten existed. The pain was still present, but it no longer drowned me. It began to shape me. That season of quiet suffering taught me something about the weight of secrets. I had carried Gavin's absences, Nora's too familiar touches, and my own doubts like stones in my pockets, sinking slowly under their heaviness. Now stripped of illusions, I felt myself rising. It wasn't freedom yet, it was survival, raw and uncertain, but it was a beginning. Sophie's laughter in the yard, the feel of the sun on my face, even the hum of the dishwasher at night became reminders that life continued. And if life continued, so would I. By the time autumn crept in, the sharp edges of grief had dulled into something colder but steadier. I walked through the house less like a stranger and more like someone preparing to leave. The silence no longer felt like punishment. It felt like a pause, a space before the next step. I knew now that tears alone would not protect me, and hope would not restore what had been broken. I needed to gather my strength, sharpen it, and hold it close. The time for mourning was ending. The time for clarity was near. It was Sophie's voice, that finally shook me out of the fog. One morning, she found me sitting at the kitchen table staring at a mug that had gone cold and said, "Mom, don't let him get away with it." Her words rang in my head long after she left for school, and I realized the truth I had been avoiding. I couldn't stay frozen in grief, waiting for Gavin to decide the next chapter. I had to take control not just for myself, but for her, because she deserved a mother who fought back. I started with the bank. My hands trembled slightly as I sat across from the branch manager, asking to freeze every joint account and card Gavin could access. The man explained the process with a polite distance, but when he slid the forms across the desk, I felt a steadiness I hadn't felt in months. Signing my name over and over was like drawing a line Gavin couldn't cross again. By the time I walked out, the accounts that had funded his late-night dinners and secret gifts were locked. For the first time, I had acted before he could, and the power of that filled my chest with something close to relief. That afternoon, I pulled out the folder where I kept documents we usually needed for taxes, account statements, business filings, insurance papers. I spread them across the dining table and sorted through them with a highlighter in hand. Gavin had always acted as if he was the architect of our success, but the paper trail told another story. My inheritance, the money my parents had left me, was woven into every milestone of his career. Without it, his brokerage never would have taken off. I realized those funds were my anchor, now untouched and solely mine. That money would be my war chest. The next step was finding an attorney. I didn't want just anyone. I wanted someone who understood how to dismantle men who built empires on other people's sacrifices. After a few discreet calls, I was given a name, Denise Harper. Her reputation in Sarasota was formidable, known for her composure and precision. When I met her in her office, she listened without interruption, as I told her about Gavin and Nora, about the birthday party, about Sophie. When I finished, she leaned back, folded her hands, and said, "He's underestimated you. That's his first mistake. Let's make sure it's his last." Walking back to my car that day, I felt lighter, as if I had finally shifted from defense to offense. Denise had outlined the first steps: temporary custody of Sophie, protection of my inheritance, and a financial audit of Gavin's business. She explained everything in calm, measured tones, never promising more than she could deliver, but her confidence wrapped around me like armor. I knew I wasn't alone anymore. At home, I began to pack. Not in a rush, not with tears, but with careful intention. I filled boxes with my clothes and Sophie's belongings, folding each item neatly. The jewelry my parents had given me went into a locked case, tucked safely under my arm when I carried it to the car. I scanned and copied every important document, storing digital files where Gavin couldn't reach them. With each box I carried out, I felt the house loosening its grip on me. When I left for the last time, I didn't look back at the suits hanging in the closet or the bottles of cologne lined on the dresser. Let him come home to the emptiness. Let him see what life looks like without me. His reaction came faster than I expected. The first call lit up my phone as I sat in Denise's office signing custody papers. His voice was strained, almost panicked. "Marion, what the hell is going on? My card just got declined. Are you trying to embarrass me?" I held the phone to my ear and listened to the sound of his anger, then pressed end call without saying a word. The silence I gave him was more powerful than any argument. For years, I had absorbed his rants, trying to believe his excuses. Now I owed him nothing, and that realization was intoxicating. That night, Sophie and I moved into a small rental on the other side of town. It wasn't fancy, but it was ours. The walls didn't echo with arguments, and the bed didn't smell like betrayal. Sophie helped me set up her room, arranging her books and taping photos of her friends to the wall. We ate pizza on the floor, laughing at how strange it felt to start fresh. and for the first time in a long while, I slept without fear of what Gavin was doing when he wasn't home. In the days that followed, I watched the ripple effects of my choices spread into his world. Friends began to mention stories I didn't have to ask about. Cards declined at restaurants, whispered complaints at his office about missed payments, murmurs of tension between him and Nora. I didn't need to lift a finger. Every decline, every whisper was a thread unraveling the image he had worked so hard to maintain. I stayed quiet, focused on Sophie, and let the cracks in his facade widen on their own. One evening, as I tucked Sophie into bed, she looked up at me with a small smile. "You seem lighter, Mom," she said softly. I kissed her forehead and realized she was right. The weight that had bent my shoulders for years was beginning to lift, replaced by something sharper, something unshakable. Gavin thought betrayal would make me weak. He had no idea it had given me the strength to fight back. But strength has a way of attracting storms. The more I pulled away, the more desperate he became. The banging on the rental's front door one night rattled the walls, his voice calling my name as if the rules of our old life still applied. I stood in the hallway with Sophie behind me, phone in my hand, ready to call the police if he didn't leave. Eventually, the pounding stopped, and I watched him from the window, slumped in his car, with his head in his hands. For a flicker of a moment, he looked small, stripped of the arrogance he once wore like armor. But I didn't feel pity. I felt certainty. His unraveling had only begun. After that night, when Gavin's fists pounded against the rental's front door, I realized silence was no longer enough. Cutting him off financially had shaken him, but I needed more than distance. I needed strategy. Denise's words from our last meeting came back to me clearly. When you strip away a man's resources, you expose his character. That's when the real leverage begins. She had been right. I had taken away the easy money, but now it was time to turn his own habits into weapons he couldn't defend against. The phone calls continued in waves, angry at first, then pleading, then filled with empty promises. I never answered. Watching his name light up my screen gave me more clarity than any conversation could. I imagined him pacing his office, trying to charm lenders with stories while his cards declined one after another. Friends began to whisper about the change in him. One even called me privately, her voice low, to tell me Gavin had stormed out of a dinner when the check bounced and Nora had to cover it with a visibly shaking hand. I didn't laugh. I simply tucked the information away, like another piece of evidence, each humiliation a reminder that control was no longer his. Meanwhile, Sophie saw the change in me. One evening, we shared a pizza on the living room floor, just the two of us surrounded by unpacked boxes, and she looked at me with a small smile. "You don't seem so heavy anymore," she said softly. Her words landed with a weight I couldn't describe. She was right. The grief had shifted into something else, something steadier. Every no I gave Gavin, every unanswered message was a new boundary I had built, and Sophie could see it as clearly as I could feel it. The first deliberate step of my plan was to control the narrative. I had stayed quiet for months, swallowing my pain, letting whispers define me. Now I wanted those same whispers to expose him. Denise helped me gather documentation proof of the funds I had invested into his brokerage receipts, showing how my inheritance had built the foundation of his business. She advised patience, but I knew timing mattered. Sarasota was not a large city when it came to reputation, and Gavin's circle thrived on appearances. All I had to do was let the truth surface, one carefully placed fact at a time. The opportunity came faster than I expected. A former client of his, Mrs. Whitaker, stopped me outside the grocery store one afternoon. She had once trusted Gavin to handle the sale of her property, and I could see the unease in her eyes. "I've been hearing things," she said cautiously. "Is it true he's struggling?" I paused, measuring my response. Then with calm steadiness, I said, "All I know is that without my inheritance, his business wouldn't exist. That's not something he's ever admitted." I left it at that. By the following week, the rumor had taken on a life of its own. People began questioning whether Gavin's success had ever been his at all. Nora wasn't spared from the fallout. Mutual acquaintances mentioned that her job had become strained. Clients no longer wanted to work with someone tied so closely to a scandal. Screenshots began circulating of messages she had once sent bragging about upgrading from me, messages meant to wound me privately, but now exposing her arrogance publicly. I didn't need to lift a finger. Her own words were undoing her. At night, sitting at the kitchen table with Sophie asleep upstairs, I marveled at how little I had to do. Their own choices were dismantling them faster than I could have planned. Still, I stayed careful. I checked every joint account for hidden debts, combed through insurance policies, and made sure every document was secured. I kept Denise updated, her calm voice, assuring me that the legal strategy was building exactly as it should. Patience, she reminded me, is power. She was right, but patience didn't mean passivity. I began to attend community events again, walking into rooms Gavin used to dominate. People looked at me differently now, not with pity, but with a kind of quiet respect. I carried myself taller, smiled more easily, and let the questions come without rushing to answer. My silence had become its own weapon. The shift became undeniable one Friday evening when Gavin showed up at a steakhouse I had chosen for dinner with Sophie. The moment I walked in, I knew it wasn't chance. He was waiting. Nora perched beside him in a dress that didn't quite fit the confidence she tried to project. Eyes followed us across the dining room. Whispers stirred as I guided Sophie to our table. Gavin stood abruptly, his voice too loud as he called my name as if performing for an audience. I turned toward him calmly, my hand resting lightly on Sophie's shoulder. "We need to talk," he demanded, his jaw tight. "No," I said simply. The word carried more weight than a shout ever could. Gasps rippled through the room. Gavin faltered, his expression cracking in front of everyone. Nora clutched his arm like an anchor, her face tight with forced sweetness. "Don't make a scene," she whispered. The irony nearly made me laugh. I looked at her squarely and said, "You made the scene the night you decided my marriage was disposable." The whispers grew louder, spreading like wildfire through the restaurant. I leaned closer to him, my voice steady. "You thought I'd be the woman crying in the dark while you flaunted your affair. Look around, Gavin. You're the punchline now." His face flushed crimson, his mouth opening and closing without words. I turned away, guiding Sophie back to our table, and the room seemed to exhale as though a verdict had been delivered. We ordered dessert as though nothing had happened, but across the room, Gavin sat frozen, his reputation collapsing in front of the very people he had tried so hard to impress. That night, as I walked Sophie to the car, her hand in mine, I felt something deeper than satisfaction. It wasn't just revenge. It was reclaiming the voice I had buried for years. The confrontation had been public, but the strength had been private, built one silent refusal at a time. And I knew this was only the beginning. Gavin and Nora believed humiliation was the end of the battle. They had no idea it was just the first step. Word of the restaurant confrontations spread faster than I imagined. Within days, videos surfaced online, grainy phone footage of me dismissing Gavin with a calm no, of Nora clutching his arm, of the room breaking into whispers. I hadn't asked for it to go viral, but once it did, I understood its value. People weren't laughing at me anymore. They were laughing at him. The man who had once strutted into boardrooms now found himself the subject of hashtags and late-night jokes. I stayed silent, knowing every attempt he made to spin the story would only dig him deeper. Gavin tried to reclaim control the only way he knew how, by pretending. He posted photographs with Nora on social media, smiles stretched tight under captions about love conquering everything. The comments told a different story. Old clients mocked him, friends teased about his credit cards, and strangers pointed out the cracks in Nora's painted smile. Silence became my weapon, and it worked better than I ever dreamed. Each time I refused to respond, the rumors multiplied. They weren't my words tearing him apart. It was his own history finally catching up with him. Not long after, a new clip made the rounds. Someone had filmed Gavin in a parking lot slamming his hand against Nora's car hood, shouting while she cried quietly behind the wheel. The video was short, but it told a complete story. Whatever illusion they had tried to maintain collapsed in that moment. People who once defended them fell silent. Investors who had been hesitant began backing away. I watched it on my laptop one morning with coffee in hand, Sophie peering over my shoulder. "He looks pathetic," she said softly, and I nodded. I didn't feel pity, not anymore. I felt justice settling in, quiet but unshakable. Denise called that afternoon with news that made me grip the phone tighter. "He's bleeding clients," she said. "Investors don't want their money tied to a man trending for all the wrong reasons. This is leverage, Marion. Use it." Her words were clear, her tone steady. I knew what came next wasn't just about humiliation. It was about dismantling him piece by piece, not with anger, but with the truth laid out where no one could deny it. The first court hearing arrived in the thick of summer, the Florida heat pressing against the courthouse windows as we filed inside. Gavin walked in wearing a tailored suit that no longer fit him quite right, the lines sagging as if they had lost their shape. Nora trailed behind oversized sunglasses hiding most of her face, her heels clicking too fast against the marble floor. I sat with Denise, my back straight, my hands folded calmly in my lap. For the first time in years, I wasn't the one shifting under pressure. He was. Denise presented the evidence with measured precision, financial records showing the inheritance I had poured into his company, receipts that tied my sacrifices to his every gain. She slid documents across the table, each one a stone laid firmly on my side of the scale. Gavin tried to interrupt, sputtering about how he had built the firm with his own hands. Denise cut in smoothly, her voice low but firm. "On her dime," she said. "While she raised their daughter, while she worked 2 jobs, he funneled her inheritance into risky ventures and personal indulgences." The word indulgences was followed by a deliberate pause before she added, including his mistress. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Gavin's face flushed, his jaw tightening, but the judge's glare silenced him before he could respond. The ruling came later that afternoon, and it was as decisive as Denise predicted. I was granted majority ownership of the brokerage's remaining assets, restitution for my inheritance, and temporary alimony until the divorce finalized. More importantly, I was awarded sole custody of Sophie, with his visitation reduced to limited supervised hours. The gavel strike echoed through the chamber like a final note, one that belonged to me. Outside, I expected to feel relief, but what I felt instead was a deeper kind of calm. Gavin stormed down the courthouse steps, Nora scurrying behind him. But I walked out slowly, my heels steady against the stone. Denise placed a hand on my arm and whispered, "This is only the beginning." And she was right. The fallout spread quickly. Gavin's father, a man who once praised me as the glue that held their family together, showed up at my door 2 weeks later. He looked older, wearier, as though the scandal had aged him overnight. "I don't recognize him anymore," he said quietly as he sat at my kitchen table. "I raised him better than this. I can't clean up his messes any longer." His words carried more weight than any ruling. Gavin hadn't only lost me, he was losing the family that had always stood behind him. Meanwhile, Nora's decline was even more visible. Her once polished image crumbled as whispers about her role in the affair grew louder. Friends told me she had been suspended at work, too many clients refusing to deal with someone whose name had become synonymous with betrayal. She stopped posting online, her curated pictures replaced by silence. When she did reappear, it was defensive, bitter, and no one believed her anymore. Without Gavin's money to cushion her, she looked as unsteady as he did. At night, when Sophie sat at the table finishing homework, I sometimes paused to watch her. Her shoulders carried less weight, now her laughter came easier, and her eyes no longer darted toward the door waiting for tension to arrive. She was seeing me fight not with screaming matches or desperate pleas, but with quiet persistence and dignity. One evening, she looked up from her math book and said, "You don't look scared anymore, Mom." I reached for her hand, and for the first time I believed her. The humiliation, the rumors, the courtroom victories, they had all chipped away at the image Gavin tried to maintain. But I knew the real breaking point was still to come. He had been stripped of his shine, of his circle, of the narrative he clung to. Now it was time for the final layer to fall, the one he guarded most fiercely, his role as a father. The custody hearing was scheduled for a gray morning in late September, the kind where the sky pressed low and heavy, as if waiting for something to break. I walked into the courthouse with Denise by my side, Sophie's photo tucked discreetly into my planner. Gavin was already there, standing stiffly in a suit that no longer carried authority. Nora trailed behind him, gaunt and unsteady, her eyes ringed with fatigue. He tried to smile as I entered, but the corners of his mouth twitched like a man fighting to keep his mask in place. Inside the courtroom, the air carried a hush that made every shuffle of paper sound louder than it should. Gavin's attorney began with practiced words about his devotion as a father, his intention to provide stability, his role as provider. I sat still, hands folded, listening as if they were speaking about a stranger. Denise rose when it was our turn, her voice calm but sharp as glass. She presented bank records showing Gavin hadn't contributed a single dollar towards Sophie's expenses in months. She called witnesses who spoke about his late nights, his endless business trips, the way he had left others to carry the weight of responsibility. Each fact stacked higher until the picture was undeniable. Then came the moment I hadn't anticipated, the viral video of Gavin's outburst in the parking lot, the one of him slamming his hand against Nora's car as she wept behind the wheel. Denise requested it be entered as evidence of his temper, and the judge agreed. The room fell silent as the footage played, the echo of his voice filling the chamber, raw and angry. I didn't look at Gavin. I kept my eyes on the screen, watching the man I once trusted reduced to a tantrum that spoke louder than any testimony. When the video ended, the judge turned to him with a look that left no room for excuses. "Is this the environment you believe is healthy for your child?" she asked. His lips parted, but no sound came. Nora dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, silent now, in her own unraveling. The ruling was swift. I was awarded full custody of Sophie, with Gavin's visitation restricted to supervised hours twice a month. The words felt final even before the gavel struck. Across the room, Gavin's face crumpled, his shoulders collapsing as if the air had been taken from him. For all his arrogance, for all his posturing, he couldn't protect the one role he claimed as his shield. The silence in that room carried more weight than any applause. The weeks that followed were a steady cascade of consequences. Gavin's firm collapsed when investors finally pulled their money, unwilling to tie themselves to his scandal. His car was repossessed, leaving him stranded in a rental on the edge of town. Friends who once gathered for his dinners stopped answering his calls. Even his own family stepped back. His father told me quietly that he was done bailing his son out, that he couldn't keep watching him destroy everything in reach. His brother blocked his number. Even his mother, long his defender, admitted she was embarrassed to be seen with him in public. Nora, too, was unraveling. Rumors spread that she'd been evicted after falling behind on rent, her once polished image shrinking into hurried steps and downcast eyes. When she appeared at the next court date, her nails chipped and her hair unkempt, she looked nothing like the woman who once smirked across a dinner table at me. She sat beside Gavin, but her body angled away, her arms crossed, as if already preparing her escape. I didn't need to wonder how long she would stay. I knew her loyalty was only as deep as her comfort. Meanwhile, my world began to steady. Sophie thrived in the calmer air of our rental home. Her laughter filled the rooms without hesitation, her shoulders no longer hunched, as though waiting for conflict. At night, she worked on her homework at the kitchen table while I prepared dinner, a simple rhythm that felt like healing. I started to rebuild, not with grand gestures, but with small, deliberate steps. Each morning, I woke knowing that the choices were mine again, not dictated by Gavin's moods or Nora's betrayals. The final humiliation for Gavin came when I walked into the bank to finalize the transfer of funds the court had awarded me. The manager slid the paperwork across the desk, her voice soft but firm as she said, "You deserve this." I signed my name without hesitation, each stroke of the pen a confirmation of survival. When I walked out into the sunlight, I felt the weight of years lift. It wasn't joy exactly, but a profound sense of justice, the kind that settles into your bones and steadies you for good. I heard later that Nora finally left him moving in with another man who hadn't yet learned her history. Gavin was left alone, a hollow figure clinging to the wreckage of a life he had burned with his own hands. I didn't seek him out, didn't gloat, didn't chase the image of his downfall. I didn't need to. His destruction was public, undeniable, and complete. Still, life has a way of circling back to you in unexpected places. Weeks later, on a rainy afternoon, I stopped into a coffee shop to meet a colleague. The air smelled of espresso and damp pavement, and I was early. I settled into a booth with my latte, watching the window fog as rain traced lines across the glass. Then the door opened, and Gavin walked in. His suit was wrinkled, his hair thinned and gray at the temples, his eyes restless until they landed on me. For a moment, he froze, then gathered himself enough to approach. "Marion," he said quietly, "can I sit?" I could have said no. I could have reminded him that he no longer had any place in my life. But something in his expression, desperation, perhaps regret, made me gesture toward the empty chair. He sat slowly, as though the act itself cost him strength. For a long while, we sat in silence, the hiss of the espresso machine filling the space between us. Finally, he spoke. "I've lost everything." His voice cracked. "The business, the house, my family, even her." She left. I didn't flinch. "You sound surprised," I said, my tone even. His jaw tightened, but there was no fight left. He admitted he hated himself, that he thought about what he had done to me, to Sophie, every day. For the first time in years, I believed him. But belief didn't mean forgiveness. He asked if I could ever forgive him, if we could ever talk. I leaned forward, my voice low and steady. "You wanted power, Gavin. You wanted to be admired. And look at you now. Alone, broke, abandoned. You built this destruction brick by brick, and you made sure I watched." His lip trembled, his hands fidgeting on the table, but I didn't let him continue. "You don't get to beg for kindness when you never gave me any." The words landed between us with a finality that left him silent. I stood, sliding my chair back, and he looked up at me with eyes that begged for something I would never give. After that meeting in the coffee shop, I walked out into the drizzle and felt something shift inside me. For years, Gavin had been at the center of my world. My husband, my betrayer, my enemy. Now he was simply a man I once knew, sitting alone at a table reaching for forgiveness he would never earn. I didn't need to look back. The rain was cool on my face, and for the first time, it felt like a cleansing instead of a burden. Life after betrayal didn't change overnight. Healing came slowly in mornings where I brewed coffee without thinking of him in afternoons, where Sophie and I laughed until our stomachs hurt in evenings, where silence finally meant peace instead of punishment. The house we returned to was ours in every sense, remodeled, repainted, stripped of every trace of Gavin. Sophie chose the brightest teal for her bedroom walls, and I let her, because perfection no longer mattered. What mattered was freedom, color, joy, in places where pain had once lived. I built my career back too. For years, I had been seen as the woman behind Gavin's success, the quiet one making sacrifices while he took the spotlight. When people saw me rise after the divorce, they realized I wasn't just a shadow. I began consulting with smaller firms, teaching them to avoid the same reckless mistakes Gavin had made. There was an irony in it, profiting from the very skills he once dismissed. But I didn't chase irony. I chased stability, purpose, and the pride of standing in my own name. Sophie thrived alongside me. She carried herself taller, her laughter brighter, her eyes clear of the weight she used to carry. One evening, she looked at me across the dinner table and said, "You showed me what not to accept, Mom. I'll never let anyone treat me the way he treated you." Those words meant more than any settlement, more than any courtroom victory. They were the inheritance I wanted to leave her: strength, dignity, and the certainty that betrayal does not define who we are. As for Gavin, his downfall was his own making. Nora left him when the money dried up, moving on to someone else as easily as she once turned from me. His business folded, his friends disappeared. Even his family stepped back when they could no longer defend him. He had built his life on appearances, and when the foundation cracked, there was nothing left standing. I didn't celebrate his ruin. I didn't need to. Watching him lose everything was never about vengeance. It was about truth. And the truth had done all the work. Marcus came into my life quietly, without fanfare, and never once tried to take Gavin's place. He was simply present, steady, respectful, treating me as a partner instead of a possession. Sitting across from him at dinner, I realized how different love feels when it is built on equality instead of sacrifice. When we were seen in public together, people whispered, but this time the whispers carried no pity. They carried recognition that I had rebuilt not from Gavin's ruins, but from my own strength. Looking back now, I see the arc clearly. Betrayal tried to hollow me out, to convince me that love meant losing myself. But in losing him, I found the parts of me I had buried, the parts that are resilient, steady, unbreakable. Justice didn't come from destroying him. It came from refusing to be destroyed myself. If there is a lesson in my story, it is this: betrayal may wound you deeply, but it can never take your worth unless you hand it over. We do not stay broken. We rebuild. And sometimes, in rebuilding, we find a life stronger and brighter than we ever imagined. Before we close, I'd love to know what part of this journey spoke most to you. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you've lived through something similar, your words may be the strength someone else needs tonight.